Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. For thousands of years, the Sith plotted the destruction of their hated rivals, the Jedi, and their Republic sponsors. The Sith leaders raised massive armies, built gigantic fleets, they conjured up monsters using Sith alchemy. They enslaved entire races and corrupted proud warrior cultures, all in order to overwhelm the massive defenses of the Galactic Republic. And on numerous occasions, it seemed like the Sith were almost going to win. First, you have the initial successes in the Sith offensive during the Great Hyperspace War in 5000 BBY. Then there was the destruction of the Jedi Temple on Ossus in 3996 BBY. Then you have the corruption of Revan at Malachor V in 3960 BBY. And of course, the sack of Coruscant during the Great Galactic War in 3653 BBY. And lastly, the 1000-year New Sith War, which led to some of the darkest moments in Republic history. But ultimately, the Galactic Republic always had one major advantage that the Sith couldn't really overcome. The Republic was massive in scope, and its social and economic systems were far more complex and better developed than what the Sith Empire could offer. Plainly put, the Republic was just a more functional government than whatever the Sith could replace it with. And so no matter how patriotic or pro-Republic the average Republic citizen was, it didn't really matter. Because when the Sith approached the borders of the Republic, all local and domestic issues were dropped, and everyone consolidated behind the Republic flag. And that's because the Sith were seen as a terrifying foreign invasion force. And so the harder the Sith pushed, the more the Republic fought back. And when it comes to pure economic power and resource numbers and also manpower, the Republic would always defeat the Sith. Now, the rule of two Sith were different. They were much weaker than the traditional Sith were. They were forced into hiding, and that made them think very differently from your average Sith. These individuals came to realize that the Sith's attack against the Jedi and Republic were making their opponents stronger and even more militarized. It's like attacking an immune system. If you don't manage to finish off the host body initially, they will build more and more robust defenses, making your next attack that much harder. And so the rule of two Sith realized that their only shot at taking over the Republic was doing it internally, using the political and economic system that actually ran the Republic. But the Sith also quickly found that the Republic's political system had its own defenses, very robust defenses. There is a separation of powers and a system of checks and balances that prevented any of the three major branches of government that hold the power from becoming too imbalanced. Even after Darth Sidious became the Supreme Chancellor of the Republic, he was still in a relatively weak position, and that is because the Republic's political system was actually dominated by the legislature. The executive position was seen more as a mediator of Senate activities rather than a king-like decision-maker. Republics, during long stretches of peace and prosperity, typically develop very powerful legislative systems that are well-balanced, making radical change very difficult. What some might see as political gridlock and heavy bureaucracy might also be framed as a mature and stable political system. When lawmaking requires broad consensus, it discourages domination by special interest groups and the radical fringes of society. And this is more or less what the Galactic Republic's political system looked like post-Ruusan Reformation. It was stable and steady. The rule of two Sith understood the quickest way to control the galaxy was fundamentally shift this balance between the legislature, judicial system, and executive branch into one of the branches. They first focused on influencing as many senators as possible to gain control of the most powerful political body in the galaxy, the Galactic Senate. But for the Sith, a large body of senators was still too inefficient for their needs. The Sith individually were highly narcissistic and paranoid individuals. Many Sith were actually victims of severe trauma, oftentimes caused by their masters. This made them unable to cooperate and work with others well. This type of psychological profile makes terrible leadership because once these individuals get into power, they begin to fear losing it immediately and start spending all of their time destroying their perceived enemies rather than, governing. This is why the Sith dislike political systems run by the legislative branch, which by its nature involves a lot of power sharing. The Sith prefer a system where all the power is controlled by one individual, aka the executive branch. And so the Sith use their control and influence in the Senate to transfer power in the Republic from the legislature to the executive branch. But in order to create the right political climate for such a transition to happen naturally, the Sith heavily depended on one of their most powerful tools, the controlled opposition. The Sith and all of those individuals who seek to hold ridiculous amounts of power are mostly driven by fear. Take individuals like Sidious and Plagueis. Throughout their entire lives, they have lashed out and killed enemies and opponents, even their own families, instead of settling things in a peaceful manner. The Sith's inability to see the world as anything but black and white, or kill or be killed, sets them on this path of domination. They believe that if they lose power, they will be defeated, which of course is just Paranoid, again, very dumb way to think about things. And so the Sith are obsessed with destroying their enemies, but what made the rule of two Sith so different is their lack of strength, which led to them using more indirect methods to defeat their enemies. Oftentimes, the victims of the rule of two Sith didn't even know that downfall were created by the Sith. One of the most powerful entities controlled by the Sith during their rise to power was Damask Holdings, which was a large financial holding company and lobbying group that was basically seizing power and control over individual senators, businesses, and even entire planets using their political and financial tools. The pulling the puppet strings from the Shadow strategy would evolve into an extremely complex controlled opposition campaign, which would finally allow the Sith to seize control of the galaxy. The most famous one of these campaigns would be the entire Separatist movement. At its core, even a fake movement like the Separatist movement needed real genuine support and ideological backing. A controlled opposition doesn't create political movements and ideology, instead it co-opts them and often corrupts them from within, therefore delegitimizing otherwise pretty legitimate political views and movements. Take the Separatist movement, for instance. This was a regional movement based in the Outer Rim, a historically neglected part of the galaxy that has been underserved by the core regions for thousands of years. Many Outer Rim planets were active members of the Galactic Republic. They paid taxes, they followed all the rules and regulations, they paid tariffs, costs for import and export, yet they had very little political power in the Galactic Senate. The Separatist movement in spirit is quite similar to the American colonists who revolted against the British Crown. No taxation without representation. This wasn't really a Sith issue at all. This was a Republic issue that had gone unsolved for thousands of years because of the Republic's political and economic expansion. What worked for the core worlds 25,000 years earlier, when it was just a small budding political faction made up of formerly freed slaves from the Rakan Empire, doesn't work for a galaxy-wide government in the present. Plus, we have an economic system whose growth was primarily based on the exploiting the cheap wages and plentiful resources in the peripherals of the Galactic Republic. And due to the central government's laissez-faire approach to free markets, corporate expansion, especially in the late Republic period, resembled colonialism and feudalism more than it did capitalism. The Sith also had a hand in this. The more outrage they can create, the more inequality and suffering they can manifest, the easier it would be for them to create the conditions necessary for a political movement that can actually threaten the Galactic Republic. It's actually ingenious how Darth Plagueis and Darth Sidious exploited this, growing split between the Outer Rim and the core regions of the galaxy. The outrage against the Republic was so great that most people turned a blind eye to the moral failings of the leaders of the Separatist Alliance and the clear corporate corruption that controlled the faction. And on the other side, the Republic feared the droid army so much that they essentially handed the keys to Palpatine, creating an environment where it was completely acceptable for emergency powers to be given to the Supreme Chancellor. Everyone was so terrified they didn't even ask, where the hell did all these clones and starships come from? Because I didn't pay for that. Did I pay for that? And take a close look at Palpatine's inner circle, his loyalist committee. Amongst their ranks were all the future leaders of the rebellion like Bail Organa of Alderaan, Mon Mothma of Chandrila, and also the liberal-minded Naboo representative Padme Amidala. Palpatine managed to convince the biggest threats to his power grab to join his inner circle and advise him. Such was the brilliance of the Sith during this time, and I will attribute this more to Plagueis, who in hindsight was far more rational than Darth Sidious ever could be. But yeah, keeping your enemies close fits right into the controlled opposition playbook. Now, the controlled opposition tactics became even more important as Palpatine seized control as Emperor of the galaxy. It's clear that the majority of people do support him, at least initially, because we are going from a catastrophic galactic war to peace. That alone makes most people happy enough to submit to his will. The truth is, most people are politically disconnected, unsophisticated, or just disengaged, and that is because politics is not something everyone is interested in. Some people don't have enough time for it. Some people simply don't care. Others just aren't equipped to understand what's going on. But still, Palpatine essentially destroying the Republic is quite different from just taking temporary executive power that he's willing to give back. From day one of the Empire's rise, you have real opposition against his rule, like the Republic Loyalists, anti-imperialists, all sorts of local and regional opposition movements, including neo-separatists and pro-Jedi cultists. And all dictators, like I said, are controlled by fear, and for a good reason. That is because they have destroyed the social contract between government and the people. They have crossed the line, and now they know they'll have to defend themselves. And so controlled opposition not only helps you figure out who is actually in the opposition, it also helps you prevent that opposition from growing. The Emperor would employ senators like Gal Travis, who had a regular scheduled holonet broadcast that called for resistance against Palpatine. Gal became an outlet for frustration against Imperial rule. He actually gave people hope that someone was challenging the Empire. And of course, as the rebel unit known as Spectre would find out, Gal was a complete fake. He was working for the Empire. More specifically, he was setting up traps for potential rebel insurgents. He would plan meetings with known rebel cells and have Imperial stormtroopers waiting in the back room ready to swoop in and arrest the enemies of the Empire. The damage wasn't just limited to what he was doing. Once Gal Travis was exposed as an Imperial agent, I think a lot of people who followed him became disillusioned about what exactly the rebellion stood for, because for many, Gal was the rebellion. The Empire muddied the water with opposition figures all the time in order to make it more difficult for rebel factions to work with each other and trust each other. If you take a look at Mon Mothma while she's in the Imperial Senate, you could actually consider her as controlled opposition as well, although she clearly wasn't. But the point is, she was one of the sole people willing to speak up against Emperor Palpatine, and she was deemed kind of ineffective by Palpatine and not a major threat because she never really directly attacked Palpatine. I think Palpatine realized that letting someone like her exist in the Imperial Senate allowed him to still claim that there was some kind of, democratic process going on in his empire. And so, yeah, she was kind of being used by Palpatine. Controlled oppositions are a brilliant and low-cost move to really throw a wrench into the legitimacy of the opposition. It's far cheaper than deploying Imperial-class Star Destroyers and legions of stormtroopers into every city to hunt down a few dissidents. This is one of the main strategies used by the ISB. Agent Callus is the individual who ran the Gal Travis operation with much success, and of course, in the Andor series, we see Supervisor Dedra Meero suggest the use of a controlled opposition to help the Empire reach its goals on Gorman. In this case, the goal wasn't to trap potential dissidents and rebels and arrest them. The planet of Gorman had widespread dissent and political protest because of the Empire's seemingly unprovoked blockade and economic sanctions on the planet. Little did the Gore know, the Empire was looking to depopulate the planet so that they could mine an important material found below the planet's surface. Up until now, the Empire had tried as hard as they could to get the Gorman to overstep so that the Empire could crack down on them, but the Gorman were rich, privileged, and perhaps had too much to lose to carry out such an emotional attack. And so the ISB was brought in. When the Empire infiltrated the Gorman resistance, they let a few details about the Imperial occupation be known to the Gore in order to speed up their own radicalization. This would lead to the massive protests in the center of Palma, where the ISB had also planted their own marksmen who would carry out a false flag attack against Imperial personnel on the ground in order to trigger a much larger riot and suppression of the Gore. The false flag attack is really the dirty cousin of the controlled opposition. Together, they create the perfect environment for normal and kind-hearted Imperial citizens to support utterly brutal crackdowns and retaliations against the Gorman people. The Rule of Two Sith were masters at destroying the credibility of their opposition. Devoid of their usual tools and martial strength, Plagueis and Sidious had to use their brains to outthink and outsmart the Republic. An important reminder to all of us that in our weakest moments, we can find our greatest strengths, and at the climax of our greatest victories, our biggest flaws are exposed. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.